Hello and welcome to this next video about the City of London Police Museum. I'm Kim Biddulph and I'm joined today by Dr Debbie Linton, who is a criminologist and also amazingly volunteers for us at the City of London Police Museum and brings her experience and knowledge to lots of public tours when we're open. And since we're not open at the moment, we decided to talk to Debbie and some of our other colleagues and volunteers to tell us a little bit more about the City of London Police Museum online. So Debbie is going to talk about the Constables Oath and what that means for policing by consent today. So just let me know when you want me to move the slides on, Debbie, okay?
All right. Okay, all right. So I was going to talk about the Constables Oath, which is actually one of the first things you see when you come into the museum. It's on display, and as Kim was saying, it links with the early roots of policing and the concept of policing by consent, which is very important for British policing and any sort of benign policing system. So just to start with, I think there's been a film already by the museum on the history of policing in the city before the City of London Police were set up, the Home Office Police. But did this old system work very well? So the next slide discusses this. So some police historians feel that it did work very well before the 1839 Act, when the city police were brought in, or the Met in 1829. And it probably did, in a more rural society where everybody knew each other very well. Other police historians, though, argue that it wasn't fit for purpose, that it was uncoordinated, it was inefficient, it was prone to corruption. There certainly are some examples of when the policing system couldn't cope, and the museum touches on the anti-Catholic riots in 1780 called the Gordon Riots. And the next slide depicts a little bit about what was happening during these riots. Basically, in June, there were days of looting and rioting in London. There were anti-Catholic riots. And this even spilled over into Newgate Prison, which is shown in the next slide. This prison was near the Old Bailey. I don't think it stands anymore, but it was a very old prison. And lots of prisoners were released and there was mayhem, basically. And in the end, because the policing system couldn't work, the old voluntary system, the army had to be called in. And the army didn't know the population there, and they actually opened fire and hundreds of people were killed. So this was one of the things that made people start to think about, how do we cope when there's real disorder? Does the system work? The next slide is just discussing the fact that actually, although there was starting to be thoughts about whether, we should change the policing system, which was much the same throughout Europe, there had been a lot of opposition to introducing a government police service. And this came from all sectors of society. So some of the power elite and the wealthy were worried about losing control to the government. In fact, you see an example of this perhaps in the city, who managed to convince the government that they would have their own separate police service if they agreed to the Metropolitan Police being brought in 10 years earlier. But it wasn't just the wealthy and the powerful. The marginalised and the poor as well were worried about, for example, the poor laws being more stringently enforced against them. And obviously criminal gangs didn't want anything introduced that would be more coordinated and professional, might disrupt their activities. So the next slide does just show, and this is in the museum actually, it was a cartoon depicted by William Heath in 1829 called Slap of the Charlies, and it just depicts the struggle that Robert Peel had at the time to bring in a professional police force. So not everybody agreed to it.
Although that does depict the old Charlies as pretty incompetent, doesn't it, as well?
It does, yes, yeah, it does, and it does sort of show some of the problems you can see there. So why were the police eventually accepted, which is the next slide. Well, coming back right to the beginning of this talk, the oath in the museum gives a hint as to why people were ready for the government to bring in a police service. And because it touches on a cornerstone to British policing, which is this concept of policing by consent, which means policing by, you know, the consent of the public, the people that they're working to protect. So the next slide shows verbatim, actually, the oath today, and I think most countries around the world do have an oath. It's sometimes called an attestation, but it's frequent to have one. So shall I read this out, Kim, or
I can do it.
Okay, so
I, and then you say your name, of City of London Police, do solemnly and sincerely declare I will well and truly serve the Queen in the office of Constable with fairness, integrity, diligence and impartiality, upholding fundamental human rights and according equal respect to all people, and that I will, to the best of my power, cause the peace to be kept and preserved and prevent all offences against people and property, and that while I continue to hold the said office, I will, to the best of my skill and knowledge, discharge all the duties thereof faithfully according to the law.
Perfect. So that's actually one of the first things you see as you come into the museum, actually. And it's quite interesting because it points at some key concepts in policing right from the early days. So he's being sworn in, he or she, I should say, is being sworn in, and they're solemnly declaring to be to serve the Queen. That goes right back to the historical roots. So they're not a servant of the government. People were very suspicious that, you know, they would be a tool of the government. In fact, police officers weren't allowed to vote until 1887. So they're not a servant of the government. And it also emphasises, the first thing it talks about is the peacekeeping role, you know, to keep the peace. So it emphasises the peacekeeping and service role as much as the crime control role, which was very important. And that links in with this idea of policing by consent. They're saying that they're going to be impartial, so they're going to uphold the law. And at that time, the criminal law was greatly developing, and the rule of law, Dicey's idea that we're all officials are equal to the law, and they're promising to do that on behalf of everyone. And even today, the Police Act in 1964, you know, the police accountability is with the Home Office, the Chief Constable, who's in control of policy, direction and operations, but also the third arm of that is the link to the community. It was police authorities, then became police and crime commissions, but there's that link. So the oath, as you see it when you come in, right from the beginning, police officers, because there had been some opposition from all sectors, are swearing that they will serve everybody, and that's the concept of policing by consent, a cornerstone to British and any benign policing system. So moving on to the next slide, what else in the museum shows how policing was by consent was achieved in these early years? Well, specifically, there are uniforms on display, which is a slide in a moment, which also show early uniforms and truncheons and handcuffs, which link to the strategy of minimal force, i.e. not being armed with a gun, unlike in the Gordon riots, for example, when the army was called in. And the fact that it was a new sort of bureaucratic professional organisation with professional training as well. So the next slide, quite nice. I quite like this. This was pulled out, and this, I think, the picture on the left is a Charlie, actually, from the Battersea area. It's from the London Metropolitan Archives, and it just shows you the transformation, really, of, you know, this is how policing had been carried out, and that's been explained to you previously about how it was carried out. And then it metamorphosized really to this sort of, I wouldn't say military, because they didn't want it to be too much like the military, but you can see the uniform, a much more professional, smart uniform. I think this is a picture of Edwardian police officers from the Snow Hill police station. So moving on to the next slide, it just has a bit more information about the uniforms, which the museum has a lot of uniforms on display. And the middle picture here is a replica, actually, of one of the first uniforms that police officers would have worn in the City of London. And you can see it's very smart and more professional than the photograph you just saw of the old Charlie.
And it wasn't a uniform in a way, was it? Because it was the same kind of outfit as a gentleman would wear in the middle of the 19th century. It's smart trousers and tails. Yes,
very much so, and also a top hat.
Yes, you can see the top hat just there on the right.
So it's but more professional than what was being worn before, and uniform in the sense that everybody was wearing the same thing. And a very important pioneer for the City of London Police. You can see the old sort of battered, I think that's a replica, is it? Was that the original?
That's the top hat.
Yes.
That's an original top hat, yeah.
Original, very battered top hat. But moving on to the next slide, there was an important pioneer for the City of London Police. It wasn't the first, I think he was the second police surgeon, police doctor that is, called George Boulez-Charles, who actually, he was very concerned with the welfare of police officers and did a lot of things to help the welfare of police officers. But he was particularly concerned with the number of officers that came to him with head injuries. So that top hat perhaps wasn't protecting police officers and he designed the helmet that we see today. It was based on the ancient Greek helmet, and we still see that today. The City of London Police one's slightly different, isn't it? So that has the crest of the City of London.
Yeah. It's different to the head, yeah.
But that links in with also it adds height to a police officer, so it does make them visible. So moving on to the next slide, going back to that picture, there was a close-up before of the Snow Hill police station officers, that's in the City of London. You can see them all smartly wearing these helmets and their uniform. Some of them got caps on, but they also have, some of them, the duty band there. And that links in with the oath as well, because in a way, because police officers then, I think, were expected to wear their uniform most of the time. But if they were on duty, they put that band on. So it's on their left wrist. You can just see it. I haven't got a cursor here, but you can see a little band on their sleeve, at the bottom of their sleeve. That's it.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I think they still wear them today occasionally for sort of ceremonial or court duties.
Possibly. This gentleman here has got it on his right because he's a sergeant. Here you can see his sergeant stripes.
Yeah. So, and that was very much linked with, they wanted people to know who they were. They weren't spies of the government or agents of the government. You knew who they were. I think there was even talk that some police officers had a notice outside their house as well, but I don't know if that's correct or not. But certainly you could see if they were on duty and you knew who they were in the community because there had been suspicion about it. And the next slide just shows early on actually the mounted section. I mean, this is linked with visibility as well, that deterrent function that they had, not just that strict crime control function that the oath is suggesting that they have a service function and a deterrent function as well. So it can be seen, it's great for crowd control, less so today, obviously, but there are still some police horses in the city and in the Metropolitan Police as well. So lastly, the last slide shows some of the early handcuffs and early truncheon that police officers had in the City of London. This truncheon has the city crest on it, actually, and there are some handcuffs there. And this links back as well, thinking back to the Gordon riots and what happened there, this strategy of what we call minimum force. So police officers weren't armed with guns right from the beginning. They're still not today. I mean, the specialist units can be called in. It's very unusual that they're not across the world. And there's a case study in the museum about the Houndsditch murders in 1910, which was basically a jewellery heist, basically, but 3 police officers were killed on the scene almost. And even after that, that's nearly 100 years ago, there was a hue and cry about, the criminals are armed with semi-automatic guns. Should the police be armed with guns? And even then, I think Winston Churchill was Home Secretary then. Big debate and funeral on St Paul's Cathedral, but still, it was agreed that they wouldn't be armed with guns, not routinely. And that links back right to the early years and their oath. So just to sum up here then, really, with the concluding slide, there is a lot of debate about whether the old police system was effective or not. Amongst police historians. I like to think that it probably did suit maybe pre-industrial society where people knew each other quite well. Maybe it became a bit outdated after that. And then there was a lot of suspicion from all sectors. So I was trying to say that it was not just the wealthy and the powerful, but also the working class, as well, and other sections of society, and that the oath, when you come into the museum and you see it there, does encapsulate this idea of policing by consent, that they're not agents of the government, that they're working for everybody for the benefit of all. So that's just a summary, really.
Thank you so much, Debbie. That was really fascinating. I think it's really interesting to look at the origins of the police and the formation of the city police and metropolitan as policing by consent. And obviously there are current debates going on around policing, which are have based on this policing by consent for everyone, and making sure that is really the case. But thank you very much for telling us about those early years. Look out for more videos. We will probably be doing one on the Houndsditch murders, which Debbie mentioned in her talk, and we'll tell you more about that and other things around the museum in later videos.